Good morning, everybody, to the B-Link Innovation Series. You've been just admitted or you're coming into the room, and I'll give everybody about a minute or so to get settled. So very welcome. This is the Blink Innovation Series, and where we're going to talk about planting on Banks Peninsula. Katie, am I good to start? Okay, I'm getting my thumbs up from the team. Welcome everybody to the B-Link Innovation Series. My name is Wim de Koning. I'm part of the B-Link Innovation team that is part of LinkedIn University. So we are really happy and grateful that you're in the room, and we're actually going to talk about planting on Banks Peninsula. But before we're going to do that, and before I'm going to introduce our speakers, I just want to tell you a little bit about B-Link Innovation for the people that don't know us yet. We are the innovation hub at Lincoln University, and we basically do three things. We connect, we collaborate, and we innovate. So in other words, with these type of events that we are organizing, we're actually hoping that we actually are connecting people. So then people will start to talk together, and hopefully collaboration starts. And when we actually start working together, basically what we will get is is real innovation, because we actually help each other in that. This is a virtual only innovation space. For the ones who have been with us in our physical space on the Lincoln University campus, it was always a bustling place that you could actually network. We were going to try that today in a virtual way. So at the end of our three speakers, I will actually coach you through that. It will be an experiment, but like the only thing I could say is welcome to Lincoln University, where we do really cool stuff, and you'll be part of that today. A little bit of housekeeping. The main talks will be recorded and will be emailed to you, and so you will have the pleasure of reviewing what you've seen as well. We're going to use a Q&A session using breakout rooms, and again, there after the talks, I will coach you through that, so do not worry. Please make sure that during the main talks of our three wonderful speakers, that your video is off and you're muted. Then when we come to the Q&A sessions, I will probably ask you to do exactly the opposite, but I will again talk you through that. Let us know what you actually thought about this, because normally we do live streams and people are actually in the room. This is the first time that we're actually doing it 100% virtual. So please give us feedback on that so we can improve for the next time. So now, without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. And the first speaker that I'm going to introduce to you is, there he is Dr. Colin Merck. And he's a jack of all trades, and he is doing things with you for the one that, for example, are on our naturalist. But he's also working with Manukau Whenua and Lincoln University. He is really into the ecological restoration, and he will focus his talk on probably the best backyard that I've ever had in my life, called Banks Peninsula. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen, and then Colin will actually start sharing his screen. So there might be a little bit of a stopover. Colin, feel free to share your screen.
Kia ora koutou. I'm just getting the technology going here. So I think, how's that?
That's absolutely perfect, Colin. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, so I've created a very long title here to sort of encompass the wonders of, you know, what's in our backyard when living in Christchurch, Otautahi Christchurch here. Te Pātaka o Rakahoto, and how we sort of connect it all up and embrace it into our hearts. And, you know, for people living in the city of Christchurch, it is an amazing place in the back there. And I want to sort of focus more on the collaboration with nature rather than sort of necessarily going out and trying to replant the whole of Banks Peninsula, looking at how we can use and facilitate regeneration. So that will be kind of my theme, really. So just a few quick pictures showing the wonders of Banks Peninsula, and of course the wonderful flora and fauna, a lot of endemic species there, and rich in history and people connections, panoramas and so on. There are literally, you know, dozens of ecosystems incorporated within the peninsula. The main ones that come to mind are podocarp forests, beech forests, konini or fuchsia, Nicole forests, a lot of plants reaching their southern natural limits on Banks Peninsula, including a lot of endemic species, mountain daisies you can see there, and everything from sort of marine to subalpine, aquatic to semi-arid, around the fringes in places like near Birdlings Flat, for example, where the rainfall is as little as 500 millimetres a year, which is pretty low for New Zealand. And of course, rivers to forests. There are all sorts of initiatives going on the peninsula, lots of people engaged and doing lots of different things. You know, there's the Geopark, and of course, we've got the amazing inspiration of people like Hugh Wilson over at Henawai, the largest private reserve in the country, and the Centre of MIM. What does MIM mean? Minimum Interference Management. You know, this is one of the inspirational sort of thinking that Hugh has shared with us, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. And I can't sort of go past also the integration between people and nature, art, culture, and so on. And there's some amazing examples around the fringes, Taitapu Sculpture Garden, and of course the Akaroa, the Giant's House in Akaroa, which is a completely different sort of thing, mainly exotic plant species associated with the sculptures. Importantly, we need to make sure we don't incorporate any invasive species. And of course, all the people, lots of communities working, looking after and restoring nature across the peninsula. I think I'll sort of skip over this. I sometimes just like to remind people that ecology, which is what I am, comes from a Greek root word, the home, and it's the same Greek root word of economics. And so I like to sort of think, you know, we need to be more holistic in our economics as well as in our ecology. And, you know, I see some sort of convergence with Mataranga Māori. So just a bit of background there. I was asked to comment on what is biodiversity. Okay, we think we all know what that is. It's just the wealth of species in the world. But in particular, it's the endemic indigenous species of a place that are local and unique to that place, and it's our contribution to the total global biodiversity. And we all have, and nations have, a legal moral obligation to protect that, because we are the only ones in our place that can look after our biodiversity. And we know we're in, you know, the 6th great extinction in the world. You know, that's a bit of a gloomy consideration, but there's so much more now that we can do locally here. And importantly, it's distinct from species richness, which is just the total number of species in a place, regardless of whether they are indigenous or exotic and introduced or invasive. And so it's important to make a distinction there. Now, I've used the citizen science platform, iNaturalist, to quickly look at the number of species that have been recorded on Banks Peninsula, and there have been 100,000 observations, believe it or not, by about 2,500 people of 4,700 species. That's of plants, animals, wildlife, insects, fungi, etc. So that's pretty incredible. Okay, so jumping into you know, a bigger picture now and looking at the way habitat and patches of forest and kind of fit together across the landscape. Now, we know that, for example, the Canterbury Plains has lost much of its natural environment. And of course, Banks Peninsula also lost a great deal during the first period of colonisation, European settlement. It was just down to a few percent of the original, almost 90% forest cover of the peninsula. But it's slowly been sort of trickling back again, and we've now got sort of patches. We've got bigger patches, but like the bottom part of that diagram, and we've got intermediate sized patches, and we've got individual trees or just little groves, and they're variously connected with corridors along rivers, along roadsides even, and fence lines and shelter belts. And importantly, there are people working and living and recreating in between those places, interacting with that nature, and sort of learning about nature, which is going to be important to, the future of the planet, that we better understand nature. I think I'll skip over that one. There is different levels of sort of patch value or richness. So, you can just have a habitat that's providing food resources for wildlife, but often our wildlife has almost like zero tolerance of predators, and so you've got to provide a higher level of protection for those. These can be fenced sanctuaries, or very intensive pest management may be required to achieve that highest level. I mentioned the sort of corridors that connect those patches that can be linear stretches of hedge-like plants or mixed forest species like that just provide stepping stones or places for wildlife to kind of move from patch to patch. So that's quite important in terms of establishing connectivity through the landscape. Some of those corridors may be stream sides like this, with all the sort of specific species that occur from the water's edge right up onto the terraces. And we'll look at some other kinds of corridors a little bit later on. So I want to sort of throw in here, of course, a lot of the energy around conservation and restoration on the peninsula and out across the plains is now to do with, the tui corridor, bringing back the tui as an iconic indicator species of success of the can't think of the word, the natural functioning of the ecosystems. So those pictures there, they're slightly sort of fragmented, different parts of Banks Peninsula. The little blue flags are actually all the records of tui that have basically returned since they were reintroduced to Hinawai and parts of Banks Peninsula, but over a decade ago now. And what I wanted to really sort of point that I wanted to make in this situation is that there are also initiatives out on the plains to create a sanctuary environments, and how these kind of have halo effects that spread wildlife out from those protected source populations across the landscape, even in the very sort of modified landscape, and they are interacting with habitats and foraging out for food, but they're also interacting with people as they do that, and raising, that sort of transformative connection between people and nature. So you can see there's like a halo coming out from one of these proposed sanctuaries out near Travis Wetland on the plains, but importantly, there's a big kind of purple arrow there showing the halo effect from the Banks Peninsula populations of tui, out across the plains and connecting with those other ones, so that you've got these overlapping halo effects. And incidentally, tui have been seen out on the plains now in a couple of places, just on odd random occasions, like at Lincoln and Springston and out in North Canterbury. So getting down to the nitty gritty here, talking about sort of conservation priorities. Protection, protection, protection. The first priority always in conservation is protecting what we've got, because we can only second guess nature when we're sort of planting and restoring. We need to look after those remnants that still survive, where you've got the very sort of natural connection between those plants and habitat with the underlying soils and geology and landforms and drainage and so on. So nature knows best about that. The next thing I've mentioned, minimum interference management. And this is, you know, one of the ways to facilitate, regenerate nature by working with nature, bearing in mind that there are some prerequisites for it to work well, which I'll come back to. I've added in monitoring there. Keep a record of your success, which will kind of inform your adaptive management. Pest control is going to be an important thing to achieve that wildlife value. And then we've got planting habitat as sort of almost a last resort, but something that we all like to do, going out and planting some trees. And I'll mention that at different scales. Importantly, any planting that's done should be eco-sourced, that is using local plant material. Then looking at how that will reconnect the landscape, ensuring ecological integrity across those landscapes, assuring natural character. You know, Banks Peninsula is in good shape in that regard. I mean, you can look around any sort of view and you'll see patches of nature already. You know, out on the plains, it's a little bit more sparse. Wildlife will naturally disperse, but as I said, there's different levels of pest animal exclusion, and we may need to even look at you know, real hardcore sanctuaries to get some of those real charismatic threatened species back into the system. And of course, you know, there's even translocation, like for example, you know, some rare invertebrates, macroinvertebrates have been reintroduced into Quail Island, for example, Otamahua. I'll be always ongoing management. Right, need to move on. So facilitation, minimum interference management, great model. We should be doing lots of that, and regeneration is happening all over the peninsula. And I mentioned sort of like 6 elements which are important prerequisites to that being a successful process. First of all, one's got to be careful about letting, say, gorse roll over new landscapes. If it's already there, then it provides a nursery. But we must ensure that it doesn't, for example, invade rocky bluffs and cliffs where there are lots of rare and endangered daisies and endemic species and so on. It only kind of works relatively well if there is adequate moisture, if there's adequate rainfall, because if not, the litter from gorse, for example, builds up, you know, so deep that seedlings established in the top of it can't get to the soil before the next drought comes. There needs to be a seed source nearby, of course, existing natural seed sources and vectors for those, wildlife to carry the seeds around, or wind. There need to be no exotic browsing mammals, which will just clean out most of our native plant seedlings, except Kānuka is an exception to that, which is not palatable. We've of course got to keep fire out forever, and we've got to have an ongoing removal of invasive plant species. But you can see, for example, regeneration, mahoe and podocarps and so on under a willow patch, actually, just on the edge of Banks Peninsula there. So we've got this patchy landscape, maybe sort of 20–30% of it's now recovered from the complete almost removal of forest 100 years ago, and you know, there's scope for enhancing that in places. We're trying to kind of rebuild a mature countryside landscape with indigenous elements in amongst the utilitarian aspects of landscapes. And when we're planting, we need to do it right. It's a scale thing, you know, that we're not often going to be looking at re-vegetating a whole valley, but we may provide some little seed sources where there are gaps, or provide some sort of corridors. But I'm going to particularly focus on some small scale things shortly. Anyway, just a guide to what some of the kind of iconic species are and major habitat types that one might be looking at restoring. As far as grasslands are concerned, slightly controversial. There are some particular cases where maybe light sheep grazing is appropriate to maintain that particular kind of landscape. All of these things need much more debate than we've got time for now. Starting from the top, then, you've got the grasslands, montane cedar, beech, mountain totara forest, there's the associated cloud forest, where it's very sort of continually moist, like kotukutuku or konini, tree fuchsia. On the drier slopes, you've got totara, hohere, kowhai forest, with kanuka sort of often being the nursery species. On shady and foot slopes, matai, hohere, manatū forest. Floodplains, kahikatea, pokaka, manatū. Coastal bush, ngaio, akiaki, akaraho. And of course, I mentioned one of the options that are being explored is using kanuka as a nursery, which it naturally is, but employing some light sheep grazing, which won't eat the kanuka once it's established, but to keep the grass down, to keep the grass competition, exotic grass competition down. And then, of course, there's individual rare species, which we may wish to enhance the populations of, Pittosporums of caudatum, fragrant olearias, and so on. And of course, buffering, where we've got exposed patches of bush, the scope for providing some hedge planting, native hedge planting around the edges to protect those and make them more secure. Okay, I mentioned sort of scale. I think a lot of the planting that might be done on the peninsula might actually be in individual sort of properties around homesteads, around on relatively small scale, and these can provide local beauty, local connection, and local engagement in restoring nature. And of course, natural regeneration will start to then come in on top of what you might have established in terms of the structural species. And so there's lots of scope for doing micro habitats, within houses, within courtyards and patios and so on, and bring it right into the heart of our place. So lovely clematis there, climbing up a pergola, not old man's beard, I should emphasize. Buffering, I've talked about, using native hedge plants like pahuihui as a wonderful butterfly and lizard food source, but which can provide an important protection of bush edges, and also along fence lines and shelter belts within the context of a farmed landscape, so that we come back to something not like this, but more like this, where we've got much richer landscape full of bush and nature, with wonderful corridors along roadsides, along rivers, etc. Maybe if we're really ambitious, one day we might restore moa. There's all sorts of stuff going on, but some of our surrogates for extinct birds, like the Cape Barren goose there, for example, and all of the actions that we need to take to provide habitat for some of these rare species. There's going to be ongoing need for weed control. Biosecurity issues, of course, are always in the background. Some of the particularly bad things are species which mimic native forest species that are evergreen, shade tolerant, and dispersed by birds. Holly and ivy immediately come to mind. Sycamore, of course, is quite shade tolerant and invasive, and is going to be a major problem across the peninsula. There are wilding conifers, which we've heard about in recent discussions. And if we don't control some of these things, they'll be on an upward, exponential graph. So finally, management and maintenance is going to be extremely important. Don't bite off more than you can chew when you're doing stuff. Animal and weed control. I mentioned monitoring, record keeping, even photographic records from some sort of set photo points, and importantly, to archive them, to record progress in relation to environment and goals, and to support adaptive management, modifying methods as you learn. One of the monitoring platforms is, of course, iNaturalist. And finally, which Penny may sort of touch on too, we've got sort of bigger concepts around national park cities, which of course for Christchurch includes the wonderful Banks Peninsula, and Penny is going to sure pick up the role of Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust, going for it, and going for whatever works and learning as we go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Colin. Well, I think you did a wonderful job as well to introduce Penny, and I can't do it any better. So our next speaker is Penny Carnaby, and she is representing the Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust. Penny, over to you. Penny, you're on mute. Like I said, everybody, this is our experiment, and so we.
Share screen.
Yes, Penny, we can hear you. Absolutely fantastic.
And I'm trying to share this screen, and I think is that working? Yes,
it is actually. Yes, fantastic.
I'm just not back to where I need to be. That's the only thing. Is that working?
Yes, that is your first slide that we're seeing. Planting on Banks Peninsula. That's what we're seeing.
And I will just. Okay. And
absolutely perfect.
That's a miracle. Excellent. Okay. Kia ora, everyone. Ngā mihi nui, o tēnā rā. It's a real pleasure to be talking about a place that all three of your speakers today, one way or another, just are so engaged with. We are so lucky to have the landscape and the environment of Banks Peninsula right at our back doorstep, or in some cases living in it. What I'm going to do is just sort of go through why Banks Peninsula is so special in terms of biodiversity. I'm going to go through a brief history of the Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust, because it's really the story of what landowners and the community are doing on Banks Peninsula to bring to life a lot of the things that Colin's talked about. And I'm going to talk about the vision of 8 goals, of which really sort of align all of those who are working in biodiversity on the peninsula. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the signature projects, and then I've been invited to talk about what's going to be happening in the next 10 years. That's a bit of a challenge. But look, the landscape of Banks Peninsula, when I look at this photograph, if you take your eyes to each one of those bays right round the peninsula, Okaroa Harbour in the middle, and then right round to the southern Port Hills, round to Sumner, Red Cliffs, and then background the peninsula. In every single one of those bays, landowners and communities are doing extraordinary things to foster biodiversity in this wonderful landscape. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. Colin touched on, where we'd got to with Banks Peninsula in the early 1900s, and really we were down to about 1% or 2%, whichever source you read. It was pretty well had it. So European arrival, 1830, there were it was pretty well covered with massive old growth forest, and then by the 1920s, it was down to 1 or 2%. And when Hugh Wilson did his botanical survey of Banks Peninsula in 1996, it was up to around 14% native forest covering. And I spoke to Hugh the other day, and he thinks that it's probably, I think we can safely say 20%. So you've got a landscape where nature is fighting back, and it's really around natural regeneration of the native bush, and it's extremely exciting. So in terms of the Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust, it was established, it's got an interesting history for those of you who are interested in land politics. There were a lot of regulations coming in about areas of special significance in the environment. And basically landowners on the peninsula, they wanted to protect these special areas, but they didn't want these regulations coming over the top of them. They understood their land, and anyway, went to the Environment Court, and the landowners won, and the Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust was set up really to work with the landowners of Banks Peninsula to protect the natural environment. And very quickly, I think 2003, the trust became a covenanting authority. I think the only independent covenanting authority in New Zealand. So it's under exactly the same regulations and legal framework as the QE2 Trust. So we're very lucky on Banks Peninsula. We've got two covenanting authorities. And we, in 2017, we developed with the ecologists at Lincoln University and Canterbury University and various other people, ecologists, botanists, we developed a vision of 8 goals of how the ecological vision for the Banks Peninsula, what we would need to do to achieve the recovery of the native environment or natural environment. The ecological vision really guides, is the anchor to a lot of activities of many trusts, organizations, and agencies. And I should say that the way we're working together on conservation on the peninsula is that we talk about being community-led, agency-supported, and I do want to acknowledge the fantastic work. We work together with ECAN, with the council, City Council, and with DOC. And together, it's a very powerful cocktail. And those are the 8 conservation goals that I was talking about. So basically, I'm not going to talk about all of them today, but I will talk about some of the landscape scale projects that we're looking at. So rather than, we're going to look at the landscape scale projects, we're going to look at pest-free Banks Peninsula, which is goal 8, and we're going to look at the protection, which is around covenanting. If we think about conservation and encouraging biodiversity, we really are looking at almost a trifecta, I suppose, and Colin touched on it in his conservation priorities. First, we need to protect the land, and then in some way, and ensure it's protected, and that's usually through covenant. But also then, once you've protected that land, you actually need to manage the pests and the weeds. So it's actually quite a commitment. These are the priorities of the trust, and I'll move on. So let's look at when I talk about landowners leading, and that in 2001, the trust being set up. So it was really around habitat protection. And by that, the covenanting is a massive, it's in perpetuity protection of the natural landscape. And it's we're going to have a big celebration next year. The Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust is just about to sign its 100th covenant on Banks Peninsula. And if that, you don't know what that means, what it means is that there are 100 patches of land, some very large and some very small. Some might be a special rocky outcrop, others may be, up to 400 hectares. But they're covenants that are protected in perpetuity. And each one of these has been an intervention from a landowner on Banks Peninsula who has wants to protect the part of their land and the natural environment. It's it also in the habitat protection, the covenant, we're talking much more about carbon farming, carbon credits, and I think there may be some MPI people watching today, so I'll touch on that a little bit more about the whole carbon sequestration benefit of habitat protection. That's the first thing. This is a covenant, in fact, is our own covenant that my partner and I have. And that's just after a few years of, on one side of the fence, the land's been grazed, and on the other side of the fence is a recovering landscape. With the covenanting of the Banks Peninsula Trust, we offer a covenant support program to landowners, and we also do the, I'll just go back, so that we do a lot of monitoring, so we can see how the bush is recovering. We look at the check that we have a management plan that the landowner works through, which includes pests and weed control. So it's and you can, it's just a joy to see, what's happening in terms of, the recovery of the native regeneration, and it's sitting alongside kind of living, working farms. So landowners are making that choice of which bits of their land they wish to protect, and which bits they wish to continue to farm. And it really is quite exciting to see what's happening. Now, in that ecological vision for Banks Peninsula, I want to talk about two of the programs, and what I'd like to really emphasize here is that we have learnt to collaborate across multiple agencies, across multiple trusts, and we just have a belief on the peninsula that we achieve more by doing it together. So the first program, this is goal 8 of the ecological vision for Banks Peninsula, is the Pest-Free Banks Peninsula program. And this is really a vision and very much supported. It would not happen without the support from Environment Canterbury, the City Council. And it really is a vision to basically eradicate or in some areas control pests on Banks Peninsula. We're starting on an area we call the Extended Wild Side, which is 23,000 hectares, Kaitariti Spit, which is off to the side of it, heading towards the, out onto the plains. And it's a massive funding project, including and part of DOC and Predator-Free 2050, who are other partners. So Pest-Free Banks Peninsula has 14 partners. And this is, I think, one of the things that makes conservation work on the peninsula so special, because it's a combination of mana whenua, landowners, the council, stock, NGO, not-for-profits, and as I said before, community-led, agency-supported. There are a lot of pests on Banks Peninsula. We have had, these are some of the pigs that we're turning our mind to. I can answer questions on the pest-free program later on, but the real success has been in terms of feral goats, we think we will achieve basically elimination of goats on Banks Peninsula by 2024, and that's a real cause for celebration. And we've got pigs and we've got deer, and it's complex. But we've got a great team on the ground working, and it's you know, it really does. It's part of that trifecta. We've got that protection of land through covenants, QE2 or Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust covenants. We're now looking whole scale at controlling pests, and Colin referred to these you know, corridors, if you like, of connection that is so important to encourage wild biodiversity. And this is a picture of the wild side, and all of those overlaying red bits and green bits are all land that have been protected in some way. About 25% of the wild side of Banks Peninsula, 13,500 hectares, is now protected either through covenants or the council or DOC. So it's pretty exciting. This is an example up in the Kaituna Valley, up near I'm just trying to think for people not from Christchurch, but anyway, this is a patchwork of connecting covenants, connecting corridors, BPCT covenants, QE2 covenants, public covenants, and retired lands. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to create those corridors where you know, biodiversity and the tuis and all of the things that Colin referred to, how they can thrive. So the other landscape scale in goal 4 of the 2050 vision for Banks Peninsula is in Whakarapo, or Littleton Harbour, and Te Kahuhu Kahukura is a joint project of 20 collaborative organizations and agencies. So you'll see that theme of collaboration, large scale collaboration, all of us doing our own you know, with our own focus and expertise, but helping each other. And as I say, more by doing it together. And Whakarapo, we've got a wonderful vision for Whakarapo through Yvette Couch, Rapaki Marae, Whakaora, Healthy Harbour, anchors us in that strategy for that part of the peninsula. And to the left of this photograph, you've got the early hills of Te Ahu Pātaki, which is a wonderful sort of public purchase of the Mount Herbert Bradley area, just fantastic. In the middle, you've got Otamatua Quail Island, part of Te Kahuhu Kahukura. But what I'd like you to notice here is we have a vision. Te Kahuhu Kahukura means cloaking, or it's a cloak, or we're going to cloak the Whakarapo hills with native bush, and it's happening. So it's very exciting. This is a better picture, and it's from our house window in Littleton. So I look out on that every day, and I see the trees growing in front of me. In terms of planting, one of we've worked with ecologists to see where some of the podocarps might have been naturally and wouldn't naturally regenerate quickly through the cocksfoot grass. So we've got a vision, or we've got project. I was planting on the weekend on Otamatua, and so was Colin, of planting 10,000 eco-sourced totara in this area. And we've planted the first 3,000. And so that's all happening in the Te Kahuhu Kahukura collaboration. So in 10 years' time, just to wind up, what will we have done? What will have happened? Well, I think we'll continue with this large scale collaboration. I just think it works, and I think we all are very motivated by it and learn so much from each other. The 8 conservation goals will have, it won't just be the TUI that we've released. There is a pecking order that's not meant to be a pun, in terms of which would be the next species, but certainly the TT are recovering out in the Stony Bay area. There have been people talking about riflemen, but anyway, as the pest-free Banks Peninsula, as it becomes more conducive, then that certainly will happen. And also it will be, I believe, in 10 years' time, we will be an exemplar in terms of pest control, if not eradication. So those conservation goals will be humming along. And yes, we will have some the pest-free. I haven't talked much about carbon sequestration, but in terms of the audience today, we're doing a lot of thinking about native forests and the emissions trading scheme, but more importantly, because it's been quite hard to get some areas of Banks Peninsula in the emissions trading scheme, we're looking at the voluntary carbon market. And there's some very exciting developments there where landowners can get a return, a carbon return for offsetting. And of course, this, we talk about ourselves as being the lungs of Christchurch. It will contribute to the climate resilience strategy and the issues of climate change, because carbon sequestration is very much part of that. We will have made great progress on the farm environmental planning. We're currently working with MPI on that, providing support, environmental plans, biodiversity plans, sometimes on a catchment by catchment basis, to support landowners on the peninsula. And I don't know what this is. So to finish, I think what I've covered is a remarkable landscape, which has, you know, areas of naturally recurring vegetation. There's the peri-urban and urban side of Banks Peninsula. They're making extraordinary progresses with generous landowners in terms of the covenanting of their land, the protection of their land. We're looking at controlling the pests and ensuring that carbon sequestration is you know, that is maximized, and also controlling a lot of the weeds that are the ones that we really do need to control. But I think, you know, I want to finish by just, I suppose, with you there, Shireen, talking next, is really to acknowledge and thank all of the landowners on the peninsula, to all of the trusts and organisations, the runanga, and you know, it might not be popular, but to always, I just don't think we'd do any of this without the agencies, ECAN, City Council, DOC. We are so grateful for all of that support. And we can do more by working together. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you so much, Penny. That was absolutely fantastic. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Shireen, and I had the privilege to actually staying at their homestead multiple times. Shireen is one of these landowners that both Colin and Penny refer to, and starting off with farming, and then very actively getting involved with the conservation side of their homestead. Shireen, I'll give the floor to you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, well, on our farm, am I definitely up?
Yeah. Do you want the screen?
Okay. On our farm, we looked at it when we first arrived. It was very run down, covered in gorse, and we decided what are we going to do, which areas we're going to protect, which areas are we going to farm. So we fairly quickly gifted an area to the Department of Conservation because, of course, we didn't have the money to fence the area. So we gifted a reserve. After that, we started to covenant our other valleys that we wanted protected. And we've also, our covenants cover a variety of habitats, and they are a bit different to the usual covenants. For instance, the penguin breeding habitat, we graze the whole of the penguin breeding habitat because long rank grass is really bad news for penguins. So to protect them the best we can, to keep the predator control going well, we have to graze the penguin breeding habitat. We've also put one area, which is one of our latest covenants, the Mabel Hope Covenant, and that is a restoration covenant. Now, I've got a bit of an argument with the Kānuka. Kānuka, I can see in a global warming situation, Kānuka is not a good idea. If you have a look at Kānuka trees on a hot summer day, you can see them glistening, and they just secrete this oil, which is just waiting for a spark to ignite. So we are fairly wary about needing to provide fuel breaks. That might be, this is a concept overseas where you have corridors of grazed country to protect native forest blocks. And I think with Kānuka, as one of our natives, this is really, really important. And the ability of a farmer to be able to control the Kānuka in the areas that are designated fuel breaks. So we're very hands-on. We have to be, because we've got Christchurch City Council reserve above us. That's full of gorse and more Kānuka. And we are directly downwind northwest. So if a fire started up in the council land, then the fire would sweep down our gullies. And so that's why we have to be very hands-on on our farm. In saying that, I mean, we've got a heap protected. We know where all our biodiversity is, and we do our best to protect that biodiversity and to look at corridors. But yeah, keeping in mind fire control or fire, we're easing the danger of fire. So we do plant the Mabel Hope. What would have been down in our gullies, we know that we had Nickel palms. We know that we had Kahikatea and Matai. We suspect there might have been other podocarps as well. And so we have introduced one or two that we reckon would have been there. So what we're doing is we're trying to do a complete restoration of a lowland podocarp forest, trying to bring in everything that would have been there. There's a lot of Kānuka in there, and that is left to grow, but where trees that are more fire retardant species, such as Yanios and things like that, trim up the Kānukas so that those trees can come up through and alleviate the fire risk within the covenant. So, it's very hands-on in that one covenant. Of course, we've got different covenants, and the other covenants are completely hands-off. So yeah, we're trying all sorts of different ways of doing things. The other thing is, of course, I don't know whether you are really aware of the concept of, C3 plants, C4 plants, the ones that sequester the most amount of carbon, atmospheric carbon out of the atmosphere. Oh, well, grass is a C4. It's very, very good at sequestering carbon, but it needs the natural way to lock it. and that's through herbivores. And this is where farmland can really come into the picture, through providing your fuel breaks. And if a fire does sweep through the area, you lose all your trees. The grassland is going to sequester the atmospheric carbon faster than your burnt block of forest. So I think in the future, we've got to really think. I mean, it's lovely to think we can stop fires, that fires just won't happen. But unfortunately, fires will happen. And it just takes a lightning strike, or it takes some stupid people lighting fires up in amongst snow tussock, which I've actually stopped 3 people from doing. So, you know, fires can start so easily. And so I think in planning, with all of our covenants, with our plantings, we've got to think, okay, how best to protect these areas to make sure that firefighters can come in safely and try and stop those fires from absolutely burning through everything. And I think it would be very interesting actually to get a firefighter into one of these conferences. So, you know, you get their concept and their picture on what we need to do to help them. So yeah, of course, penguins is the main thing we do protect. We do a heap of predator control. Predator control is very, very important. I wouldn't be too worried about a few deer hanging around, but I certainly would be very worried about pigs. Pigs are terrible. They root up everything. I've seen rocky outcrops where pigs have actually rooted up rocks to get at the geckos and all the sort of things that are underneath the rocks. You wouldn't believe what pigs can do. They are a diabolical pest. So if we can keep the pigs off the peninsula, yeah, that's the most important thing I think that we need to focus on. Can't think of, can you think of anything else? Yeah. The only other thing I want to talk about is regenerative farming techniques. I dare say a lot of people are familiar with that now. And the microorganisms that are under the ground. One of the bacteria in the ground is very good at controlling methane emissions. It's called a methanotrop. And methanotrops are wonderful little bacteria in that they can actually digest the methane, but they also, the more methane that's thrown their way in a habitat that they like, the faster they will multiply and be able to deal with methane. So there is a way which you can look at looking after your methanotrops in the ground around farming. And of course, the regenerative farming techniques look at that and how to do that, keeping everything working together as it should, because our herbivores shouldn't be a problem, but they are a problem because we don't farm them the right way. We've got to be able to farm them the right way. So the whole way that nature set it up, herbivores locking atmospheric carbon through eating grass and all these microorganisms working together, pulling the carbon down into the ground, locking it through manure. It's a system that should work, but our ways in poisoning the ground by using synthetic fertilizers and spraying horrible chemicals on crops and things like that, all of these things will actually affect what's under our ground. And what's under our ground is actually really, really important. Of course, it does very well in native forest. I believe the highest population of methanotrops found in the world is in a Canterbury red beech forest. Where that is, I'm not sure. Is it on the peninsula or is it somewhere else? But yeah, So having a bit of red beech around is a jolly good idea. So yes, in the Maple Hope Covenant, some of our red beech is going in there as well. I think really I've just about covered everything. So.
Shireen, thank you so much. That was really interesting, and even being at your place a couple of times, I've learned even more. So thank you so much. May I ask Colin and Penny to switch on their videos again? We are actually going into a Q&A session. Since we have a relatively compact group, I suggest that we're going to have the Q&A session within this group. There are a couple of household messages. If the participants actually move their mouse, and they will actually see a button on the bottom of the screen called reactions. There is, if you click that, you basically see raise hands, and I'll do that right now. So at the moment you see me raising my hand. I think that that will basically trigger me to allow you to ask the question. Please make sure that you unmute yourself and switch on your video, and then please introduce yourself before you ask the question. And so the floor is open for questions. Well, let me start with the first question so that everybody can get a little bit to grips with that. Shireen, when I had the pleasure of visiting you, I think what I thought was amazing is that you connected not only the land but also the sea and the sea habitat together. Do you think that the sea is a crucial plays a crucial part with this replanting and conservation of Banks Peninsula?
Yes, I do. Well, the thing is, as we had a few really serious floods, and really, you know, the erosion is a problem, although we've had such bad floods that they've actually taken out mature forest. But yeah, it's a whole picture. I mean, the thing is, everything is interconnected. Protecting your waterways is extremely important. And in our bay, we do covenant or try to protect all of our waterways. Of course, with us, sea is very connected with the penguins.
Thank you very much, Shireen. I see Edgar switched on his video. Do you have a question, Edgar?
Perhaps I could ask
one question. I saw a video perhaps a year ago of a science guy who'd worked on Banks Peninsula. It was a very engaging documentary that had been made, and so I'm really fascinated by the conversations here, really extending and giving us a glimpse of a peninsula-wide project or multiple projects. So I'm not sure that I can recall that man's name, but he talked to having been there for 30 years and using extensive gorse coverage as a nursery process for nitrogen sequestering, you might say, and then developing. And so what you're doing, what the people who live there, seems a fantastic extension of that. So yeah. Really, I'm just responding and saying, hey, this is really fascinating to me.
It might be the video I think you're referring to is one called Fools and Dreamers, which is by Hugh Wilson on Hinaway. And I'm sure, Colin, maybe talk about the theory of gorse, because, you know, there was a bit of a battle at first in terms of people really feeling that, because, you know, gorse had always been the enemy of farmers. And maybe just talk about what's happening on Hinaway, because it was a wonderful video, and Hugh was called a fool and a dreamer when he first suggested the idea.
Yes, well, you've pretty much introduced the concept there around using gorse as a nursery. It's a quick, rapidly growing cover which shades out the grass, and as Edgar said, fixes nitrogen into the soil, so sort of conditions the soil. And importantly, from the point of view of it acting as a temporary nursery, it is shade intolerant. So once native evergreen canopy penetrates up through it and covers over the top of the gorse will eventually die out because it needs continual light. Now, I went into quite some discussion about the prerequisites for that system to operate, and they're all provided on the site where Hugh has practiced this for the last decades, 30 years or so. And the first thing is that it's not, the gorse isn't covering over any other important natural vegetation. Secondly, that there are seed sources nearby, and of course Hinawai does have remnant patches of native forest all through it, so they're a perpetual source of propagules, seeds that are being distributed, some by wind but a lot by birds. Thirdly, importantly, you must keep browsing mammals out, because most of our native plant seedlings are extremely palatable to introduced browsing mammals. And I noticed Shireen mentioned deer there. One of the major problems on Otamahua Quail Island at the moment is deer swimming across and cleaning out all of the seedlings that are being planted there, as well as regeneration. So that's a major problem. So a lot of our seedlings are like ice cream to these animals, unfortunately. So for regeneration to occur, you really have to have a very strong control of those browsing mammals. Next, of course, as has been referred, we have to keep fire out of the system for, decades or forever, basically. And of course, unfortunately, gorse is quite fire prone. So obviously, if it's burnt, it provides a perfect habitat for itself to regenerate, and so that will perpetuate if it gets burned. And so also, in order to get the full ecosystem sort of churning over, there'll be ongoing weed and pest control. But yes, it's an important model. It works in relatively high rainfall areas, like around Wellington, for example, similarly happening there, as long as, again, doesn't get burnt. So that seedlings, so that there's not too much litter buildup on the ground, and so seedlings that do fall into there can penetrate down to the soil and get established. It can take, sort of 15, 20 years for the gorse canopy to start to open up a little bit and let those native seedlings sort of start to come up through and eventually overtop and suppress the gorse. So, it's a waiting game. You have to be patient, but it does work very well in that sort of circumstance.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Shireen.
Yeah, the one nursery plant that I've really found to be absolutely excellent is the nio tree. It seems to attract the birds. They eat all sorts of berries from all sorts of places, and the amount of interesting trees that come up underneath nios is just amazing. And also, when it rains, the nios actually, the water drips off, and you get lots of ferns and all sorts of things growing up underneath nios. They just seem to be the best of the lot. And of course, they're a lot less likely to burn as well.
Absolutely. And of course, the stock don't like them. As you know, they're poisonous, so yes. Not so much fun for them.
Thank you so much. I see that Sam has his hand up. Sam Mender, over to you. Please introduce yourself and ask your question. You are still muted, Sam.
Always good to. Yeah, hi, good morning. Thanks very much for the wonderful presentations. Yeah, I'm Sam. I work for my own consulting firm actually, and we work heavily in the carbon space around Banks Peninsula in particular, and we have succeeded a lot actually in getting post-89 native through in a regen scenario. But from my observation, and I think it was what you were talking about, Penny, is most of the trees are too old to get through the ETS. But you mentioned about the voluntary carbon markets and having, was it success there? I'm just really interested to learn more about that, if you're able to shed.
Yeah, for sure.
light on that.
Look, I am not an expert in this area, but I'm learning by the minute. But what we've set up is on Banks Peninsula it's a sort of informal group, the Banks Peninsula Native Forest Climate Change Group, and it was a very long name, but basically it's a group of people, agencies, people with expertise who are trying to get their heads around, you know, what the best models are for landowners. And what I mean, the ETS is the obvious way of getting return for carbon sequestration, but there are, as you know, it can be size of area, or it's been quite hard because of the lookup tables are not all that nuanced in terms of native vegetation, as I understand it, and it's much easier to get carbon returns, ETS returns for a monoculture like pine trees, because it's easy to measure, and whereas with native forest, we've got regional differentiation from the North Island, the South Island, the different coasts. And so what various firms and around the world really, you've got this balance of people sort of saying there is one group that we've been working with to try and understand more. It's using AI, artificial intelligence, to estimate the carbon sequestration potential of a piece of land. I won't mention the firm because I don't want to, you know.
I know you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah, and they've been absolutely, they've had research grants, and we're getting more and more success in terms of large corporates sometimes who are wanting to offset their carbon footprint, and therefore their money is that provides an income for those landowners who want that, and it's called the voluntary carbon market.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as tied up in regulation. Sorry, that's a very kind of muddled answer, just by way of saying that it's emerging. I think it's exciting personally, and we've got a situation at the moment on Banks Peninsula where we're looking at, I suppose, experimenting with about 2,000 hectares in this voluntary carbon market. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks very much.
Really as a past librarian, I remember the emergence of the open access movement and Creative Commons, which is there's a period where new ideas get challenged and people are trying to work out how to do it. But I think it will emerge, and I think it will give a return and encourage native vegetation. And we're very keen to do that on Banks Peninsula. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam, for your question. Annelies, I've seen your hand. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you. I just wanted to, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
I just wanted to talk about weed control. So Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust is doing a great job. There's a lot of weeds that are on private land. And I'm just speaking here from Little River and seeing how the old man's beard is getting out of control. I wonder how the Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust could help. I thought it would be an idea to get landowners together, the landowners that actually have the old man's beard on their properties, then ask the community to help out in weeding these. It's just the organizing of it. So initially, I think it would be great if the landowners took the initiative, and then the community would be more likely to join in. It's getting quite serious.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree with you. And I talked about that trifecta of biodiversity, of protection, pest control and weed control. And look, what a couple of things with a BPCT covenant and I think QE2 as well. There's a management plan that everyone who signs up for a covenant, undertakes, and part of that is weed control as well as pest control. But we do put people in the field to. We have groups of volunteers. And we monitor all the covenants, and where there's a big weed problem, we try and help out the landowner. I agree, it is the landowner's responsibility, but it's also brain-numbingly difficult in a whole lot of areas. So that's by way of saying, yes, we need to control the weeds, and the trust does put in volunteers where there's a real problem. So basic and on covenants, but the weed is far broader than that. I don't know whether anyone, Shireen or Colin, can comment further, but it is so important.
Yeah, no, I would like to comment on that. The thing is, I got all paranoid about old man's beard. I thought it was in our covenants. And so I went in there and I diligently cut out all of our native kilometres. I found out we didn't have old man's beard. So I would be very careful about getting local landowners to control their old man's beard. You've got to know what you're doing and you've got to know what it is.
Shireen, they are it's very obvious where they are here in Little River.
Yeah.
They see it at a completely different time of year. But yeah, I just want to make clear, I am aware of what's happening on the land with the conservation trust, but it's the private land that there's no oversight. And so even having I don't know, he can come in and actually see this and this and this is where it is. Okay,
I think he can, and the council have they're doing extensive work, and that would be my recommendation. I think if it's not covenanted land, to make contact with one of those two agencies. Colin, do you know any more?
Yes, I was just going to sort of generally comment on the sort of weed issue and picking up on Shireen's comment about, sometimes a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. There have been terrible losses, ongoing losses of particularly sort of native scrub, grey scrub, matagari and so on, through rather overzealous attempts at spraying, aerial spraying and what have you. And unfortunately, the only thing that benefits from that is more exotic weeds. Earlier, ivy and Tradescantia and sycamore in particular, but I'm going to mention 3 Bs, which are particularly concerning to me. First, it was bone seed, which is more prevalent in the Port Hills kind of area, but it's probably extending further into the peninsula. Boxthorn, which is quite localized, but is a shocking spiny plant, which we really need to get on top of before it spreads. But the one that is of most concern to me, which is sort of almost under the radar, is blackberry. And this is a really difficult thing to deal with because it's so prolifically spread by birds all over the place. And you can just imagine what our bush would be like if the whole thing was sort of completely, you know, underpinned by blackberry. It would make our excursions into the bush much less pleasant. So, you know, it's a difficult thing to get rid of, but, you know, the best time to start is now rather than 10 years down the track when it's even more prevalent.
Thank you so much. Any other questions in the room? Well then, oh, I see Nikki Davidson clapping hands. I assume that is a thank you. Another question, Nikki? I think it is. Hey, thank you all very much. Thank you, the panel, Shireen, Penny, Colin, absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for all the participants. Please give us feedback, and we've learned a lot. If you want to know more, on the 13th of September, we are pushing boundaries, looking at the dairy industry. And on the 22nd of September, we are embracing urban agriculture. Thank you so much, and please join us again.
Thank you.